The Edmonton Oilers lost the Stanley Cup last year in Game 7. What does recent NHL history say happens to teams after losing the Stanley Cup?
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So today, we are going to take a look down memory lane. We are going to use history, and we are going to compare how the Oilers are faring to start their season to the teams that have lost the Stanley Cup and what they've done the following season. So we're going to start in the abstract. In the first segment, we're going to talk about philosophically and why practically it's really hard to maintain a competitive team that's good enough to go to the Stanley Cup final and then get there again the following season. Our second segment, we're going to walk through the last 10 Stanley Cup losers, what happened to them in their given seasons. And then we're going to tie it all together in our final segment with a little bit of an overarching thread about the pitfalls of success. Because I feel like there is an inherent human nature that really makes it difficult at times to maintain a high level. So starting at the beginning, at the base level, the way professional sports in North America, at least, it's different in soccer, which I do find refreshing at times. But in North American sports, we have a very redistributive method of talent in the sports. The way everything is set up in football, baseball, basketball, and hockey, it is set up to try and make the bad teams better. It is set up to penalize good teams. The way the rules are set up in terms of the draft, in the terms of contracts, in the terms of salary caps, everything is set up to try and redistribute talent across the league so that every team can be competitive. Of course, there are more factors at play than that. Some teams don't want to spend the money to be more competitive. You know, there are entire baseball teams whose salary is less than what Shohei Ohtani is going to get paid for this season. There are entire players in the NBA who make more than 4 or 5 MLB teams put together. So when you think about where the Oilers are at, and of course we want to look at this through an Oilers lens, they got to a Stanley Cup after many years of gradual improvement, of building out around Draisaitl and McDavid. And make no mistake, it took a while to get the supporting cast right, to draft Bouchard, to trade for Ekholm, to find the goalie who was both cheap and effective simultaneously, to find the right mix of supporting guys, to identify Zach Hyman, to bring in somebody like an Adam Henrique at the deadline, to, for lack of a better word, find passable guys on your back end in Cody Ceci and Brett Kulak, to identify Philip Broberg in the draft. You know, it takes a while to line up all of the chips and to get to a good hand that you want to be aggressive with. And when you think about it, the Oilers had to pay the price, both physically and roster construction wise. Physically, as we've talked about, the NHL season doesn't start till the first week of October, second week of October, depending on the year. They report to training camp the second week of September. For the Oilers last year, they went from the second week of September until the last week of June. We are talking almost all of September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May, June. If you want to be generous and not count the full month of September, we're still talking 9.5 months. A 9.5 month journey to get to a Game 7 of a Stanley Cup final. You had maybe 7 weeks to detach and reset. You had July, you had August, And by the first week of September, guys were back in Edmonton participating in captain skates, trying to ramp up, trying to get ready for the season. 7 weeks is a very, very, very short period of time to reset. And look, these are world-class athletes. It's not like back in the day where guys would hang out in the offseason, they wouldn't work out, and they would use training camp in the preseason to get into shape. These guys are still working out. They might not be working out as intently or as aggressively as they would be in season for maintenance purposes, whether we're talking cardiovascular stuff, whether we're talking strength training, endurance training, what mobility training, flexibility training. All of that stuff in season is essential. You need that stuff to maintain what you have. And, we know guys do get into better shape as the season goes along, as they reach that peak. And ideally, you get to that physical peak around March or so, and then you hit a wall, and then you start to plateau, and then you start to decline because the injuries start to accumulate because the season is so long. And I do think that matters. I know there are going to be people who would disagree and say they're professional athletes. There's an expectation that they're physically ready. I don't disagree with you. I just think that's ignorant of physiology. I just think that after 9.5 months, 7-8 weeks of reprieve, it's not a lot to work with. It is not a lot to work with, and it is hard to reset in that short period of a time, especially because these players know, well, this is the only time I have. I have to cram in everything I would like to do if I want to travel, if I'm getting married in the case of McDavid, all of that stuff, that makes it even harder to get real reset time in. And there is an expectation that these guys are able to find that decompression and then come back ready to go. And it's hard to stay intense and focused for that long. And I think that's part of it. And then number two, the Oilers got dinged for their success. They had to cut off a lot of salary, and some of it was by choice. They didn't have to go get Victor Arvidsson and Jeff Skinner. They didn't have to put Evander Kane on LTIR, but they chose to do that. They said, we lost to Florida because we did not score enough. So we need to upgrade from Ryan McLeod and Warren Fogle to Jeff Skinner and Victor Arvidsson. We need those guys on our team to provide more depth. We will figure out the defense. We will figure out Dylan Holloway. Of course, that's not ultimately what ended up happening. So you lost 3 defensemen from your Game 7 lineup last year. And right now, you are dealing with the repercussions of trying to turn over 6 roster spots in a single offseason in your starting lineup. That is a lot of turnover. You're talking 1/3 of your lineup is not the same as last year. And last year's team, it took a little while to get going. Don't get me wrong. It took Jay Woodcroft getting fired to really light a fire under them to get out of the funk they were in. But right now, it's hard not to feel like the Oilers are stuck in the muck a little bit. And a lot of it, I think, is frankly from offseason stuff. I think, and we'll talk about this more in the third segment, but the Oilers are a lot better than they've played talent-wise. But when you watch them, they're not playing the style of hockey that has made them successful the last handful of years. It is really, frankly, quite alarming at times how inefficient and how clunky it looks for what is supposed to be a fast and a skill-based team. But we are going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. And when we come back, we are going to take a walk down memory lane, talking about the recent Stanley Cup losers, what their following seasons look like, and a whole lot more. So be sure to stick around. Your sex life is important, but your schedule is busy. And that's where today's sponsor, Hims, can help. You don't have time to go to the doctor to get treated for ED. Through Hims, you can get a personalized ED treatment without stepping foot outside your door. Hims is changing men's healthcare by providing you with access to affordable sexual health treatments from the comfort of your couch. Hims provides access to a range of doctor-trusted ED treatments like chewable hard mints, Viagra, and Cialis, and their generics for up to 95% cheaper. The process is 100% online, so there is no need for uncomfortable doctor's visits. Just answer a series of questions on their site, and a medical provider will determine the right treatment options. If prescribed, your medication ships directly to you in discreet packaging for free. No insurance is needed, and one low price covers everything from treatments to ongoing care. Start your free online visit today at hims.com/locked-on. That's HIMS.com/locked-on for your personalized ED treatment options. hims.com/locked-on. The products mentioned are chewable compounded products which are not approved by or verified for safety or effectiveness by the FDA. Prescriptions require an online consultation with a healthcare provider who will determine if appropriate. Restrictions apply. See website for details and important safety information. Subscription required. Prices vary based on product and subscription plan. Today's show is also brought to you by our friends over at Gametime, the only place I buy tickets to get to games. And right now, Gametime is having an exclusive zone deal for the NHL Winter Classic event at Wrigley Field. Go to the Gametime app to purchase tickets. Get 10% off bleacher seats or 20 to 25% off home plate area seats. Through Gametime, you have features like the seat view, where you can get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. The lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference, and Gametime ticket coverage, where your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime Picks. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are walking through what recent history says about teams that lose the Stanley Cup and what happens to them the following season. And I understand that history is not a predictor of the future, but it is a useful tool in assessing things, in putting events in context. And when we're talking about sports, we have recent history to use as a trend line, to identify if recurring themes emerge. For instance, if a specific style of play becomes in vogue, a specific type of player becomes in vogue, or a specific means of allocating roster salaries, or a type of coach, all of those things are part of the recipe of putting together a team. But when you can identify a specific prevailing trend, that can enable you to be ahead of what might be coming down the road. You look at where the Oilers are at right now, and they're not off to a particularly auspicious start. They're sitting at 6-7-1 through their first 14 games this season. And then when you look back at recent history, last year, the Panthers came out of the gate 9-4-1. The year before that, Tampa Bay 7-6-1. The year before that, Montreal 3-10-1. The year before that, Dallas was 6-4-4. Boston went 11-1-2. Vegas went 6-7-1. Nashville went 7-5-2. The Sharks, the year before that, 9-6-0. The Lightning 6-6-2. And then the Rangers 6-6-2. So there are differing tiers of these teams and how they came out of the gate following losing in the Stanley Cup. Some teams are more acclimated and better situated to get off to the great start. And I think you see that when you see a team like the Bruins, who came out of the gate 11-1-2, the best record through first 14 games of the last 10 Stanley Cup losers. And you think about how the Bruins lost that cup final to the Blues. You think about how close they got. They also got to a game 7. They got blown out in game 7, but they got to a game 7. And frankly, they got to a game 7 against a team they were better than. That Bruins team was better than that Blues team. Of course, the Blues ultimately won the Stanley Cup. But you think about the veteran core. You think Marchand, Bergeron, Pasta, Chara, young McAvoy. You think about the goalie situation with Tuukka Rask. That team, very well situated to respond to a difficult environment. And then when you think about some of the teams that have been a little more slow out of the gate, the 7-6-1 Tampa Bay team, I think that Tampa Bay team was absolutely fried. You think about going to 3 straight Stanley Cup finals. Of course, they won the first 2, but by the time they got to that third one against Colorado, they were out of gas. They hit a physical wall, and Colorado's speed started to wear them down. And 2 years ago, Tampa Bay, entered a different phase of their roster. You lose an Alex Killorn. You lose an Andre Palat. You lose some of the depth you had accumulated over the years. You have to salary dump guys. You have to maintain your expensive players. You paid Vasilevsky. You paid Braden Point. You needed to maintain your expensive core, so you had to lop off some of your depth. You lose Blake Coleman, you lose Barclay Goodrow, you lose Yanni Gourde. You have to remake an entire line of your team. It's only natural that eventually, even with success, as great an amount of success as Tampa Bay has had over the last 10 years, eventually the bill comes due. And you look at some of the other teams that have come slow out of the gate. The Vegas team, I think that Vegas team that lost in its first year to Washington in 5 games, they hit an emotional wall. That Vegas team, the foundational year, the first year they were in existence, was one of the great nobody believes in us runs in the history of professional sports. We've seen it from time to time. You think about the Nick Foles Eagles. That was a team that parlayed nobody believes in us to winning the championship in their sport. Ultimately, of course, Vegas came up short. But the emotional toll of riding so high all year long, beating teams that were better than you, beating the Winnipeg Jets in that conference final is one of the great accomplishments of the last 10 years in the NHL, because that Vegas team, though successful, was nowhere near as talented as that Winnipeg team. And that Vegas team, the year after, it hit a wall. They lost in the first round. And when you look at the Tampa Bay team last decade, after losing to the Blackhawks the year after that, they were 6-6-2. And then the Rangers team after that, 6-6-2. I do think if I were to categorize where the Oilers are at, I think they're closer to that Lightning and Rangers duo back-to-back years that went 6-6-2 out of the gate. Because that Rangers team that lost to the Kings, they eventually got going the year after. They won the President's Trophy. They made it to the conference final. And then ditto, the Lightning team that lost to the Blackhawks the following year, they ultimately lost to the Penguins, who went on to win the Stanley Cup. But those were young-ish teams. The Rangers a little bit older than that Tampa Bay team, but that Tampa Bay team, young Kucherov, young Braden Point, not Braden Point. I was thinking Tyler Johnson, shows how old I am, and Palat. And you still had Stamkos, and you still had some holdovers from the St. Louis era, but it was transitioning. It was going to Hedman's team and Andre Vasilevsky lurking in the wings to take over for Ben Bishop. But I think the Oilers are closer to that. A team that maybe overachieved a crumb the year before, and they had to deal with the emotional turmoil of losing a series that they felt they had a chance to win, even if necessarily they maybe didn't entirely think they should be there based on how the regular season had gone, the roster composition, that type of thing. But history tells us that if you lose the Stanley Cup final over the last 10 years, you're more likely than not going to make the playoffs. Of the last 10 years, 4, 6, 8 of the 10 teams have made the Stanley Cup playoffs after losing. The 2 teams that missed, I am willing to chalk up Dallas missing the playoffs to that 56-game season with the weird divisions, and I'm a little more inclined to believe that wasn't necessarily the most fair way. They lost 14 games in overtime that season as well. And then the year after, Montreal had no business making the Stanley Cup final, one of the weirder playoffs of all time. The alignment and the format made it easy for them. That the All Canada division had the easiest path. Obviously, they played a beaten down and injured Vegas team in the conference final, ultimately went to the Cup final and lost to Tampa Bay. But Oilers are going to make the playoffs. If the Oilers don't make the playoffs, it would be a cataclysmic failure. That said, the tea leaves would tell you they're probably not making it past the second round. More likely than not, the most likely outcome is they lose in the first or the second round based on what recent history tells us about how teams handle losing the Stanley Cup. We are going to take one final break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, and when we come back, we are going to tackle some underlying themes with the Oilers so far this season and why I think they reflect a team that is struggling to overcome last year's loss. Today's show is also brought to you by FanDuel, where you can tackle NFL action at America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. In the NFL, we've got a Sunday morning, a 9:30 Eastern Standard kick. The Giants and the Panthers over in Germany. The Giants 6.5-point favorites. The best game of the weekend, though. Sunday Night Football, the surging Detroit Lions heading down to Houston to take on CJ Stroud and the Texans. The Lions, 3.5-point road favorites. You can get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are talking about what history can tell us. And like I said, history is not a guarantee of what's to come, but anyone ignorant of their history is doomed to make mistakes, to miss out on missed opportunities. And that's why I've always found history so interesting, because you might not necessarily be able to predict what's going to happen, but you can get an understanding. You can get an idea of what's happened in the past and how that might impact what's going to happen in the future. You know, I've spent quite a few episodes of Locked On Oilers this season trying to build out the principles of causes over time, long, medium, and short range causes, because they all happen. They are all interconnected, and it is all living. It is all breathing. It is constantly happening. Life, existence, history, everything is constantly happening, and it is all interconnected. Nothing is black, nothing is white. Everything impacts something else. All of the Oilers' issues right now are tied to decisions that happened years ago, that are tied to decisions that happened more than a decade ago, if you want to be really specific. So you think about where the Oilers are at. You think about the issues currently plaguing the team. And Hunter Hodes and I talked about this on Locked On NHL yesterday. The Oilers are not playing their game. They are struggling mightily to find offense. And this is a team that is predicated on scoring away its issues. They don't have a shutdown defense. They don't have Connor Hellebuck. So if you are a team that is built on offense, you are a team that is supposed to outscore any issues you might have, and you are consistently struggling to score, you naturally have to take a step backwards and try and identify what's not working. My working theory, and I said this earlier in the week, is the defensive issues are bleeding into the offense. Because as much as you don't think about defense being part of offense, the Oilers' lack of a clean transition game when Ekholm and Bouchard is not on the ice is really hurting the rest of the team. And I understand Ekholm and Bouchard get the luxury of also playing with Connor McDavid and playing on the power play and getting a lot of ice time with good players. And that it's not that that Nurse's pair and that the Kulak pair, those guys, they don't have the McDavid cheat code for zone exits. But that said, the Oilers are not doing their job. I said this after the game against the Golden Knights, and I'll say it again now. The Oilers look clunky. The Oilers look slow. They don't look like they are all the way in on what they need to be doing. And look, that's one game. I would not say the Oilers are playing terribly. I wouldn't say they're playing disgracefully. But I do think there is something undercurrent. There is an undercurrent here of unease. I do think there is an emotional toll of how last year went. And I think a lot of the Oilers' issues right now are confidence-based. I think the Oilers get behind in a game and they don't feel like they can score the goals to come back. I think the Oilers are waiting for the other shoe to drop constantly. I feel watching the team that they play so scared at times that they just don't want to make a mistake. So they lob the puck out. And at times, that's the necessary play. You're not always going to be able to skate or pass the puck out of danger as a defenseman. Sometimes you're going to need to alley-oop it out or rim it along the wall. But right now, as we sit here, I really am feeling that the consistent, disjointed, and clunky nature of how they're playing is a real cause for concern. Because if they were really humming, if they were playing their game as smoothly as they expected to, they would be generating even more offensive chances. And I understand that right now they're in a shooting funk. The special teams still need to get sorted out. I totally get it. I agree with you. I think if the Oilers don't change a thing, they're eventually still going to start scoring. But I do think there's a malaise that is creeping over the team right now. And I think you saw a lot of that in Evan Bouchard's game on Wednesday night, where he didn't have it. He made really bad decisions. He made really bad positional decisions, and it cost the Oilers the game. And I don't like getting on guys. I really, like, in my heart of hearts, I genuinely don't like singling guys out for bad performances because I feel bad. I genuinely feel bad. You know, when I tweet stats about a player and someone replies, "You're just being a hater. Why don't you like this player?" I would like nothing more than to highlight good performances. The Oilers aren't having good performances right now. Sure, it's nice you got a Hyman on the sheet again. You got Hyman another goal. That's nice. It's good that they killed a penalty in the game on Wednesday, but they got to get that penalty kill going. They got to get a save on the penalty kill. It can't keep being these 40-footers that skip on the ice and Skinner or Pickard just doesn't get there. You know, it is all interconnected. I strongly feel that this Oilers team is going to start scoring regardless of how bad the defense is. But until the defense can start to facilitate quality transition hockey, this is going to continue to be disjointed, because right now, the Oilers are expecting their star players to make difficult plays outside of structure. And McDavid and Draisaitl are good enough where they should be able to do that most nights. When you make things difficult, they are harder to replicate over and over again. And as talented as McDavid and Draisaitl are, at a certain point, they need help. They need transition help. They need line mate help. And it's going to take some time. The Oilers are still working out good chunks of their lineup right now as far as who's going to play with who, especially on defense for the long term. So the Oilers have some stuff to work out. We are going to see you guys over on Monday. That'll do it for today's Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please take an extra second and leave the show a review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. Let me know, what do you think the most likely outcome for the Oilers is this season? I will talk to you guys next week. Everyone have a safe and fun weekend.